Okay, I think I'm probably blocking part of your screen here, but so today we're going to look at the process of holding on to the Union, which is also defeating the Confederacy between 1863 and 1865, and then the process of reunion. How do you reunite this country that's been torn? And what's fascinating about civil wars, I mean, one of the elements that's fascinating is that typically if you have one civil war, your society has more civil wars, just because if you are willing to go to war over something, typically war doesn't solve the conflict and then you just have more wars, more wars. In the case of the United States, we've only had one civil war. If you count the American Revolution as a civil war, then maybe we've had two. But the main point we want to work through today is with the defeat of the Confederacy in 1865, the main question for the United States became basically this: how could it have peaceful reconciliation and a society that no longer had slaves, where slavery was no longer part of the nation, at least legally? And the result was basically that the South was an economic colony of the North and the world. That another result was racial segregation, or the purposeful and manipulatable separation of and coordination of white people and non-white people, and the beginnings of an overseas empire for the United States. That those are the kind of things that are going to ultimately create what the United States will look like by the turn of the century, or by 1900. So the first thing is we need to look at between 1863 and 1865, the Confederacy was defeated. And the defeat was pretty hard on the South. Southern whites, the Confederacy, didn't want to give up, even though militarily it looked like they really had no chance in 1864, especially after Abraham Lincoln won his presidential re-election bid. And what you see in front of you here is a photograph from Charleston, South Carolina at the end of the American Civil War, April 1865. And you can see the city it's destroyed. You can see these these young African American boys dressed up as soldiers a little bit, and this city is devastated. Now, partly it's devastated by war, partly it was devastated because there was a fire there. But basically, what you have is a South in disarray. Railroads destroyed, farms destroyed, levees destroyed. About 25% of Southern men of military age are dead. Thousands and thousands of livestock. It's just an economy and a society in disarray. So on one hand, we have a victory of the Union, but we also have defeat of these Confederates. Now, what's life after the war going to be like? It's going to be really different for lots of people. The first thing is, with the end of the war, African Americans in the South encounter and have a whole bunch of different freedoms. The end of slavery, and especially the end of it with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, offers a whole bunch of new possibilities. So, for instance, the right to go to church where you want to go. So religious freedom. The right to choose your name or to name your children. Rights to marry. Rights to divorce. Rights to move around. Even in South Carolina, there was a law against African Americans using canes before the Civil War. Well, now you can use a cane. And so all these new rights, new freedoms, caused a great deal of concern for Southern whites who, in many counties and passed what are known as black codes. And these are basically laws for African Americans who are no longer slaves, but these black codes would say things like, you can't buy property in this town, or you can't be here after sundown, or you can't meet at different times. And these black codes were, many of them were based upon laws from the North and northern towns and cities that had established before the American Civil War differential laws, laws for African Americans that were different than laws from whites. And partly a main goal of that was just to keep economic power and social control in the hands of white leaders. Now, Congress passed several acts to try to adjust to life after the war. One was called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It's often shorthandedly known as the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau basically dealt with refugees, people without homes, freed men, women, and children, and these lands that were destroyed that no one was taking care of. And here's a photograph of a school that was a freedmen's school, and you can see there's this white teacher here, and here's this teacher. And then here's the students. And you'll notice about the students, age range. There's one adult here. Pretty simple school, but basically education was one thing that the Freedmen's Bureau oversaw, and also things like hospitals, medical care. And what you see is that African Americans went to these services, used these services, interacted with white men and women from the Bureau to improve their lives. So we're going to see the southern local towns and counties and states in competition, in conflict with the federal government. So southern counties passed black codes to restrict the lives and control the lives of African Americans. The federal government is trying to pass laws to aid African Americans to get into a livable way of life after the Civil War. Not really so that African Americans have the greatest lives in the world, but partly so that they can have the benefits of citizenship, and that they can, work, do work that profits the nation. Now, citizenship is going to be encoded in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. In response to the Black Codes, Congress then passes the 14th Amendment in 1867, which basically guarantees citizenship rights to African Americans and to former slaves. It also has a lot more going on in it. You can take a look at that in the textbook. So Reconstruction is the name we give to the process by how the United States is rebuilt or constructed again. Now, the first person who's in charge of Reconstruction is President Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was Abraham Lincoln's vice president, and Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, 1 week after Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, surrenders, and for all intents and purposes, the Civil War is over. Well, Andrew Johnson had not been a member of the Republican Party. He'd been a Democrat. He represented working class whites and really cared mostly about them. So basically the non-slave holding white Southerners. And Andrew Johnson really wanted a quick Reconstruction. He wanted Southern whites and Southern states brought back into the Union very quickly. He wanted them represented in Congress very quickly, partly because he was trying to curry favor with them to support him, and he didn't care too much for African American rights. He basically thought, that a kind of minimalist approach to how African Americans should be helped. So he did things like he vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau bill, he vetoed civil rights bills, and congressmen flared up against him. A number of congressmen like Thaddeus Stevens and others looked at the Black Codes. They looked at white violence against African Americans after the Civil War, and they said, no, we can't have fought a Civil War. We can't have lost so many men to then basically have the South be exactly the same as it was before the war. And Congress tried to take authority over the process of Reconstruction. And if you go and look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, those are the Reconstruction constitutional amendments, there's this little line at the end of them that talks about how basically Congress can create new laws to to make sure to execute these amendments. And so it's basically what they're really saying is, hey, we're going to be in charge of Reconstruction, not the executive branch, not the president. And so they pass a series of acts basically trying to maintain control over the South. One of them is the Military Reconstruction Act, which basically puts, here's Military District 1, Military District 2, Military District 3, 4, and 5. And the point here is if you create a military district, you can have military officials overseeing it, and the military works for the United States government rather than for state governments. And Congress passes a series of civil rights acts basically trying to negate the black codes and basically saying, hey, you can't bar someone from owning land. You can't bar someone from going into this business or things like that. The 14th Amendment establishes citizenship rights, and then the 15th Amendment 1869 offers the suffrage or enfranchisement or the vote to African American men. And it's posed in the negative. It doesn't say all men will be able to vote. It says states cannot restrict the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, what that does is it leaves open the possibility to restrict the right to vote by other ways. So like we restrict the right to vote based on age, or you might restrict the right to vote based on criminal behavior. And so there are ways to restrict the right to vote, and the 15th Amendment doesn't say anything about sex or gender, and so women continue to be discriminated against and do not have the right to vote. So life in the South, so that's kind of politically what the federal government's trying to do. Southerners are trying to figure out how to live together and how to create a new economy. And historians debate how new was this new South? How different was it? Well, the economic relationship that emerges is basically known, we call it sharecropping, and that's a negotiation between whites and African Americans about how the society and how the economy are going to run. White Southerners really want African Americans to work in gang labor, which looks a lot like slavery had before, where 30, 40, 50 black people show up in the morning. They work, whites can whip them, they're told what to do, and at the end of the day, maybe they get to leave. African Americans wanted nothing to do with gang labor. African Americans wanted to own their own land, they wanted to have their own little home, they wanted to have their women work, stay in the home. So basically, black men just wouldn't show up. If they went to gang labor and somebody got whipped, the next day they just wouldn't come. So a compromise emerges that's known as sharecropping, which is where you share a percentage of your crop. So a white person owns the land, and an African American signs a contract saying, okay, I get the right to use this land, but I give you a percentage, a share, kind of like a share of stock, a percentage of the crop. And in that contract, it would probably say that you had to grow, that crop had to be cotton. Well, this is a nice little economic system, but if you don't have any startup money to begin with, and most African Americans do not, you don't have any money to buy supplies. You don't have any money to buy crops. You don't have any money to buy seeds. You don't have any money to buy the stuff you need. So you go to the local market and you say, hey, can I get some axes, some shovels, some wagons, and things like that? And the market owner, who might also be the owner of your land, will say, sure. You can pay me with some of your crop. That's called a lien on the crop. Basically, that you give me, you'll pay me X amount of your crop at the end of the season. And you say, okay, so now you give me a share of your crop to the owner of the land. You're giving a share of your crop to the market owner. And so let's say you want to grow a lot of cotton. Well, that's what everybody's doing. Everybody's growing a lot of cotton. Well, that means the price of cotton goes down because there's more supply. So you go to sell it and you don't make as much money at the end of the season as you thought you would. And so you don't have enough money for the next agricultural season. So you go back to the market and you say, oh, hey, I can only pay you $40, but I owe you 50, so I'm in the hole 10. So I'm minus 10, and I need supplies again. I need, more shovels. I need more seed. And so you go into further debt. And scholars refer to this as a system of debt peonage. Peonage is where you get enslaved to the land, where basically you can't move. And in this case, if you're in debt, you can't move because you owe this market owner, you owe the landowner a crop, and you owe them future crop, and so you can't leave, and so you get in this kind of cycle of debt peonage. And here you have this image you can see where a white man has his ledger book and seeing how much should this man get paid or how much does he owe. And this is what people are figuring out in the South. And so that's one way that African Americans get kind of stuck in economic poverty. And then politically what happens is a system of what's called disenfranchisement. That's where Southerners create laws that make it so that you can't vote. So they don't say anything about race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but there might be something like a poll tax, like you need to pay to vote. Or there might be a literacy test. So if if you can't read or write, you won't get to vote. Or there might be other educational requirements, and basically these are ways of limiting African American voting. And then when all else fails, here's a stamp where someone had put over the U.S. postal stamps KKK emblems. So here's KKK, here's a skull and crossbones. If all these things fail, you use violence. You use extra-legal terrorist actions to instill fear into African Americans, and groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White Caps, the Knights of the White Camellia, a whole bunch of them use terror to say, hey, if you're an African American who's trying to work your way up economically or to be influential politically, this is what can happen to you. At the same time, in the 1870s and 1880s, the United States start to create an industrial economy. And this is slightly different than just the market economy. The market economy is where people are, focused on buying and selling commodities. The industrial economy is about mass production and the use of steel. And what steel does is it allows you to move much more goods, more people, and much rapid, with much greater speed. So you can see on this map, the dark lines are railroad lines built that were in operation before 1870. In 1870. And then you can see over the 20 years from 1870 to 1890, railroads that are built. And you can see lots and lots of railroads built here in and around Chicago. And you can see this movement out into the west. Look at the connections to Omaha, to Kansas City, to Denver, all the way down here to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, all the way here into Texas. So you're going to get cattle going from Texas on railroad lines all the way to Chicago, butchered there and then sent out. So steel, which Andrew Carnegie becomes influential businessman and helps create an industrial economy. Oil, which won't be used for energy at this point, but used more so for lubrication and for lights and things like that, is going to be an important businessman. And then finally, the massive accumulation of capital and then the disbursement of it, the use of it, the manipulating of capital. So a person who doesn't do a job other than accumulate money and then use that money for business ends, that's going to be the most important person in this is going to be a guy named J.P. Morgan or John Pierpont Morgan, who's going to consolidate capital. He's going to bring lots of money together and then use that money to do things like build or invest in massive factories, to invest in massive building projects, and that's going to all create this industrial economy where the South is going to be largely growing cotton still, but then the rest of the country is going to be growing in this mass production and industrial way. So in the South, the black codes give birth to this thing called Jim and Jane Crow. Jim Crow is what it was more so known as, and that's basically how you control who can be where. Jim and Jane Crow segregation is not complete separation. The point is not to keep whites and non-whites completely separate. That because the goal is you want African Americans, you want to sell goods to them, you want them to work for you, maybe you want them to come into your home and raise your children, especially if they're African American women, but you don't want them at your swimming pools, your public libraries, you don't want them at your church, you don't want them living in your town. So Jim and Jane Crow is coordinated control of who can go where, when. And here's some signs that emerge, and you've probably seen these. So restrooms, white people can go to use that restroom, colored can use that restroom. When you get to seating on buses, trains, there's going to be, only, colored seating area. Here's a sign for who's not allowed. Dogs aren't allowed, Negroes aren't allowed, Mexicans aren't allowed. And so we think about what Jim and Jane Crow segregation doesn't allow people to do, but what it really is, where it bars people from, what it really is coordinated control. And basically that we want people of color to do certain things white people do, and then we want to keep them from other arenas. Now in 1896, a Supreme Court case, Homer Plessy versus Ferguson, brought up the issue of is this constitutional? Is it okay to have separation where black people can't go on certain things? And this was a railroad case, a train case in Louisiana. And the Supreme Court said gave the decision that yes, you can have, it is legal for states and other areas to have separate accommodations as long as they're equal. Well, everyone knew that they weren't equal, and but the Supreme Court basically gave its acceptance to this Jim and Jane Crow racial segregation social structure. So finally, by 1898, about 30 years after the American Civil War, the United States has a war where Americans don't fight each other, but they fight against others. In 1898, the United States embarks on a war first against the Spanish Empire and then against the people in those areas that the Spanish had been oppressing. So in 1898, the United States goes to war against the Spanish Empire here in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and then way over here in the Pacific against the Philippines and in Guam. And so these are the last kind of island colonies of the Spanish. The Spanish had created these colonies at the very beginning of this class. And Spanish Empire had died a long death over these 400 years. And the United States went to quote-unquote free these people. And so here's a photograph of Cuba represented as this white girl being freed. Notice her shackles are being broken. And who are they being broken by? A man in a Confederate uniform and a man in a Union uniform. And notice they're holding hands, they're shaking hands, they're agreeing to fight together to free the people of Cuba, to liberate them. Now, after the United States defeats the Spanish on these islands, the Filipinos, the Cubans, don't they fight then American soldiers because the Cubans, the Filipinos want their own liberty, want their own freedom. The United States maintains a sense of jurisdiction over these islands, and in part because they want coaling stations. They want islands, they want places where American ships can go and get fueled up with coal because the United States is expanding its trade, industrial trade throughout the world. You'll notice the United States is not getting, prime real estate. At this time, by 1898, Europe had divided Africa into jurisdictions so that the British and the Dutch and others had different jurisdictions. The British were powerful in India. The French had strength in Vietnam. And the United States is basically grabbing little colonies that it can. And it's part of this emerging global trade. And so by 1898, what we have is Northern and Southern whites, former Confederates and former Union folks, agreeing, coming together, shaking hands, saying, hey, we agree, and we're going to be an empire. The South is going to grow cotton. African Americans are going to live in a social structure, an economic structure of racial segregation. It'll be an industrial country and be beginning the rise of global trade and global authority. Okay.